You're listening to Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G., a podcast that invites you to experience the world through the perspective of one black man, one conversation, one story, or even one rant at a time. Here's Dr. G.
Hey, this is Dr. Alex G. I want to welcome you back to another very exciting episode of Black Like Me with Dr. Alex G. First of all, I want to say that I thank all of the new listeners. Folks have been helping to share the news about the podcast, and we're getting emails, and people are writing us on Facebook. They're tweeting at us. And so I want you to know that that really means a lot to me. So continue to tell your friends about the honest discussions that we're having here around race, and where we're finding out the things that we really do hold in common and some of the things that are just extremely different in our community. I have a special guest on the show today. We're going to talk a little bit about our work and how we came to know each other, but his name is Paul Fanlund. He is the publisher and the editor. His name is Paul Fanlund, and he is the editor and the publisher of Cap Times. It's a place where he's worked for a number of years, and we met just a little over 5 years ago to talk about experiences that I was having in Madison as an African-American male, and resulted in a very popular cover story that I wrote for Cap Times. And so, Paul, welcome to Black Like Me.
Delighted to be here, Alex.
You know, this is interesting. Over the past 5 years, you've interviewed me, so it's really odd to be able to be asking a question. So
thank you. Turn.
Yes, so thank you. I'll try to be as kind as you've been as you've been to me. Paul, there's something that we do at the beginning of every show with guests, but most of our guests are African American. And so I have something that's called like the Black Icebreaker. So it just gives us a chance to talk about things. And then when we have non-Black guests, particularly white guests, we'll have something that's called, what in the world are white people thinking? But, you know, we've known each other so long. I'm going to ask you the Black Icebreaker questions.
Right.
And so let me just find something for just a moment. And this is all meant to be fun. And so I'm showing my friend Paul an image. Paul, have you ever seen one of these?
I have.
What is that image?
That is a brush that you use on an afro.
Paul, you've been doing your homework. I was showing him an image of an angel food cake cutter, and so if you Google it, it'll come up. But Black people in the 70s we called it a rake. Is what we used to call to
I didn't know it was called a rake, but
yeah, we used to call it a rake. It kind of hang in your back pocket. At one point, after Alex Haley's Roots came out, they outlawed these because people started throwing them. I mean, people really got angry behind that show. All right. Okay, Paul. So I got some other questions for you. All right.
Okay.
Have you ever ironed your blue jeans?
No.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. When you were a child, were you allowed to say the word lie? Was that a bad word, or was that considered swearing growing up? Like if someone was telling misinformation, fake news, were you allowed to call it a lie?
I think lie was okay.
Okay. All right. What's so interesting is that growing up Black, that was a swear word. Like
Really?
Oh yeah, that's like saying the D word, the F word, the S word. And so that's interesting. Growing up, I'm sure you saw a lot of American Bandstand, Soul Train. Can you do the robot? I'm not going to ask you to do it, but can you do the robot?
No, I'd be the last person to do the robot, but I know what it is.
Growing up, did you have any relatives named Mookie, Junebug, Nene?
Let me think. No.
Okay. As a young man growing up, did you ever have a perm or a jerry curl?
No.
Okay. No.
That's particularly funny because the audience can't see that I am totally bald. So.
Yeah. Can you swim?
I can swim.
Okay. All right. Have you ever experienced or given a syllable spanking? I won't ask you about giving. Have you ever received a syllable spanking? Do you know what a syllable spanking is?
I don't.
Oh, okay. That was syllable spanking. Is when you're getting a lesson while you're being spanked. So it's not like, hey, Alex, come here. I told you to stop throwing rocks. It would be like, didn't I tell you time after time? And so when we're interviewing Black folks, whether they're from the East Coast, the West Coast, the South, when I say syllable whooping,
they know.
They start laughing. Oh, my grandmother used to give me that. Come here. Didn't I tell you? All right, let me see. Let's see. There's something else over here did your grandparents put plastic on their furniture to keep it from getting dirty?
They did on some occasions. They absolutely did. Yeah.
I'm finding that with some of my white guests who are my age or older, they're saying that they had that experience. I thought that was just a Black experience.
No.
Did you stick to it when it was hot? like when they would put it on in the summertime. You sit on it.
Stuck to the furniture. Absolutely.
Let me see. I'm thinking if I got any. Are you familiar with the phrase "splitting the pole"?
Splitting the pole doesn't ring a bell.
That's something that's huge in the Black community too. For some reason, if you're walking down the street and there's a tree or a signpost, you all have to walk around the same side of it, because if you somehow let two go on one side and one on the other, it would be considered bad luck or something. So you have to actually stop and go back around. So folks who are like really older or Southern, they'd be like, Paul, you just split the pole. You got to walk backwards and come back around on this other.
It's kind of a Southern version of the walking under a ladder.
You know what it is? It is or letting a black cat walk across your path. All right, Paul. You know what? Thank you for participating in that. Now there were probably some of our white listeners who were like, I know the answer to that. Yes, I've done that. But back in the late 70s or 80s, ironing blue jeans was a huge thing. In fact, in college, so many of my white friends said, Alex, why do your jeans have creases? I said, because I iron them. I starch them. That's what you're supposed to do. Like, that is crazy. You're not supposed to iron. I think it probably came out of a time where maybe in our community we only had a couple of pair of jeans, and so we wanted to make sure that they looked really, really good. But that was funny. And yeah, if you look at old pictures, you see a lot of black people with very, very creased.
I wore my jeans in the 1960s, and they were all bell-bottomed and incredibly ugly if you look at them in old pictures.
Those have been trying to make a comeback, but but they shouldn't. Some things should just stay back. Yeah. So listen, you all. I met Paul through a mutual friend. His name is Phil, and just had a number of experiences in the community that made me just want to speak out and just talk about what life was like for an African American male. So I remember taking Phil out for coffee, and I said, I need to talk to someone. I need to just let loose. And he said, well, you've got to find someone who probably has the flexibility of allowing you to tell your story in a very key place, and particularly someone who might let you write it, because you have some things you want to get out. He mentioned your name, Paul, and he said Cap Times, and he said, they might actually let you pen something. And I remember we had a couple of talks beginning probably in summer of 2013. But I remember distinctly, you were listening, we were sitting having coffee, and I told a couple of things. I talked about an experience in downtown Rotary. I talked about being pulled over by the police in my church parking lot. But then I told a story when there was a break-in in our church. And I called the police from the outside, and I said, my name is Alex G. I'm African American. I'm 50. I drive a black car. Here's my license plate, make and model. And I remember you looked up from your notes and you said, I never think to identify myself when I call the police. And I looked probably equally befuddled. And I said, I always describe myself. And it was at that point in that particular conversation where I seem to remember you saying, all right, I want you to write about your experiences. We're going to put some artwork to it. We're going to put it on the front page. But it seemed like something really resonated in that moment, that our experiences are really different. But I'm just curious. And again, that's 5 years ago, and you talked to hundreds of people. But do you remember anything about some of those preliminary discussions we had?
Absolutely do. And Phil, who you mentioned, is a dear friend of both of us.
Yes.
And still is.
Sure is.
He's an important member of the community. And he brought us together. And I came in, I write a weekly column. And I was thinking, okay, well, this is potentially a column topic. And then the more we talked, I transitioned into thinking that it was bigger than that, and suggested a cover story. Now, the Cap Times, in its weekly tabloid form, is not a traditional broadsheet newspaper.
Right.
And so we have the flexibility to kind of bring more of a magazine spirit to what we do. But this was... I may be wrong about this, but I think it was the first time, I've been with the Cap Times a little more than a decade, been in Madison for many decades, that we did a first-person essay, essentially, long essay, on our cover. And
wow.
And we worked together on it, and it came out in December, about 5 years ago,
right.
Next week, this
week.
week.
December 18th was actually the drop, 2013.
Yeah. And we worked together on the title of it, and the title, the first time it appeared, was Justified Anger. And, of course, Justified Anger took on a much bigger meaning as you move forward with it. But I do remember that, and I do remember thinking that we live in an old friend of mine who was an African American newspaper editor in New Orleans put together an award-winning series, and I always thought it had the best title. It was called Together Apart. And that's what it sort of felt like we were together, but we were living apart. And in fact, that gentleman, Keith Woods, works for National Public Radio, or did in Washington, D.C., and was here.
You introduced
at
me
first,
to him.
Yeah, at First Unitarian Society when
Right.
we did that town hall meeting, which was part of the aftermath of Justified Anger.
Right.
So that was Keith.
That's so interesting. Now, you may or may not remember this. I did not like the name initially because I was fearful of sounding angry, because the tightrope for me was, if I really express myself, am I going to piss off my white friends, and will my black friends feel like I've told too much family business? And so I just remember waking up with butterflies in my stomach. And it's been 5 years. I've only read the article twice. I read it the day it came out. And I think for some other reason I had to do that. But you're right, that name caught, and it captures what I was saying just perfectly. But even in telling my story, there was a pressure of not wanting to be offensive to white folks. And I got some pushback even in the black community. Again, I've come to love that cover, but my arms were sort of folded. Michelle took the photo, and my arms, she said, yeah, kind of fold your arms. And I was standing in that church driveway, and I thought, oh, I'm going to look like a badass. I'm going to make people mad. But I feel that the part of the response of the community was that they wanted someone to be pissed over what had happened. The Race to Equity had just been written very well, and it came on the heels of discussions around Madison Prep School for Black Boys, and on the heels of the Urban League's State of Black Madison, Black Wisconsin. I think it was State of one of the two. Very nice report that came out in 2010. But I think they wanted someone to really push the envelope. Did you get any pushback from inside the newspaper for doing something that was written in first person? It was a black person that's doing it, and they're saying that they're angry because Madison, the subtitle was Madison's failing his black community. I'm curious about what it was like on your end.
On my end, it was frankly endorsed and fairly warmly received. If I could just say a minute.
Please.
This week is the 101st anniversary of the Capital Times. A Norwegian, second-generation Norwegian immigrant named William T. Evu left the Wisconsin State Journal to start the Capital Times 101 years ago this week. We had a big celebration around our 100th last year. And through the years, and Mr. Evu lived until 1970, he was a champion of civil rights, anti-war movements, anti-McCarthyism. He was a devotee of fighting Bob La Follette. So the Capital Times, through the decades, has had, we think, a huge sensitivity and tendency to pay attention, or intent to pay attention to its issues. So I think it was in keeping with what people would expect from the Capital Times, and so I think it was not controversial.
That's great to hear. What were some of your hopes for that article?
Yeah, my hope for the article would be a lot of what happened out of it, the enormous gatherings and the momentum that came out of it. We had. At the Alliant Energy Center at Memorial High School, at First Unitarian, we had tremendous gatherings, and there was a lot of conversation about it. I was also hoping to gain more insight into the African American community in town, which I think I've done over the last 5 years. But having said that, I think it's limited. I frankly don't think any white person can completely understand the insides of the African American community. I think that one of the really profound takeaways I had, and you and I saw each other a lot after that and interacted a lot. Our old friend Darrell Bazell, who was a senior financial person at UW-Madison and is now at the University of Texas, talked about this too, about how when you're white in Madison, and I moved here as a young guy right out of graduate school and fell in love with the place and made decisions through the years to not leave, and here I am as an older guy, that it's a very different city for African Americans. And I think through getting to know you and getting to know lots of other people, that's kind of come home for me. So a lot of times I start when I have a question. The end of it, I say, but I cannot. I think I understand it to the extent I can, but I can't completely understand what it's like to be African American in Madison and have such a small, visible middle and upper class and sort of live so much apart so much of the time.
Mm-hmm. Do you think you made a commitment after Justified Anger came out in late 2013 of really focusing on those issues for 2014? And there are some folks in the community, in my community, who said, we've never seen a commitment to race relations or covering the news and our voices. And to our surprise, Cap Times kept his word on that. And for 2014, you let other voices come to the table. Other folks wrote. You brought at least 10 staff members, 10 writers to sit around what I think we call the table talk. Yeah. There are about 8 African Americans, and we just spoke about our issues while you all listened and took notes. And so I want to say that I'm appreciative that Cap Times kept that commitment for 2014. When Justified Anger was coming out, were you thinking at that point that you'd commit the following year to the subject matter, or was it the response to the article from the broader community that made you realize people are not finished talking about this?
Yeah, I would say that our friend Phil, who we've mentioned, Phil Haslinger, I've got to tell an anecdote,
Sure.
and it illustrates the larger point. So probably about a year ago, I was on a panel at the Madison Club talking about the state of media in the age of fake news and Donald Trump and so forth. And I emphasized the separation between me as publisher and an opinion writer and a columnist and our news coverage, because I really feel passionately that our reporters need to approach news with the kind of objective training they've had. So, for example, on another front, our political reporters have good working relationships with the Walker administration and legislative Republicans, and approach that kind of work. And even though the Capital Times has an opinion reputation, it's quite different than that. And I made that point at the Madison Club. Phil happened to be there, and afterward he said, well, that's true to an extent, but also we all, particularly with what we call euphemistically the media disruption of the last few years, where there are fewer writers, we have fewer resources, that you have made a decision collectively or individually at the Cap Times to pay more attention to communities of color in Madison and social justice type issues than maybe another editor would in a community of this size. Maybe we have another legislative reporter, another business reporter. So to the extent that we've made a commitment through the years in 14 all the way up till 18 to pay more attention, we still do. Now within that, there's all the decisions about what gets covered, what makes a story, so forth. But I think we continue to think about that and emphasize it till today.
I think that's really important. I appreciate that. One of the things that I appreciate about our interaction and our relationship, Paul, is that, we've had missteps, and people think that when you have different backgrounds and you're from different ethnic groups, that if you bump heads or misunderstand each other, it's just the end of it. And so I appreciate the fact that we've always been able to come back to coffee or whatever to talk through things. But even though you mentioned that you will never fully know what it's like to be Black, there are still some bold steps that you took in your leadership to help the Black voice proliferate. For example, you created a timeline with Cap Times looking at just what's happened in Madison's history. Now, 5 years ago, Justified Anger was like one of the last things. Like, I remember reading it. It's hard for me to get to my email sometimes, as you know, folks know, but I finally got to the link. And at this time, it was still being developed. But like one of the last entries on the timeline was in 2013, Reverend Alex G. wrote an article called Justified Anger. And I think it also talked about the town hall meeting. I appreciate that because that mainstreamed our experience, that it wasn't just a timeline in February for what's happened in the Black community. The other thing that caught me off guard that I appreciate is when Dave Sweefel, Am I pronouncing this?
Yes, Zweifel.
Okay.
Yep.
So one of the things I appreciate is that when Dave Zweifel had written a book about the 100th anniversary of Cap Times, you invited me. So I came, so I was standing there, and there was like a 1-minute video intro. So I'm thinking, oh, this is great. I like history. I like back. I'm from Madison. I like to to look at to look at history. I didn't know that I was in the video, and I did not know that I was in the book. I came to the event thinking, like other events, I'd be the obligatory black person that's coming to just sort of diversify the group, but I did not expect to see myself in that video or covered in the story. And so that was very touching for me also, because what it said to me is what I tried to assert, even within my Justified Anger work, that I'm a leader who happens to be black, and not merely a black leader, because you've come to enough events that I've led where most of the audience has been white because they're wanting to hear these things.
Sure.
But being a part of Madison's editorial history or journalistic history, my work was very empowering. And so I think people get stuck with race relations because they feel that it can only happen one way. And if I don't have 15 personal relationships, then I can't really make a difference. But making room for many of us to come to the table and talk about what we're doing, or making me or those issues, my family's story, my message, a part of Madison's history, was something that's very powerful, and that will outlive both of us. And so it's important for me to pause and just to say that was an important contribution. And that's not something we talked about. Like you didn't say, hey, Alex, can I put you in this book? I just showed up not knowing I was in it. And that was a real pleasant surprise.
Oh, that's great.
The interesting thing, Paul, about talking about strides in race relations is it's like charm. If you talk about it or think you have it, you probably don't. And so I know that there's a fear among my white colleagues to talk about strides that they've made in terms of race relations. But I have you here so that you can brag a little bit about what Cap Times has done in this area. So you mentioned earlier that there was this conscientious effort to lift these issues so that it would have an impact on the consciousness of white Madison, your readers, and just the community at large. And not all other media outlets followed that lead. For a couple of months, there were like big black stories because they thought, oh, black is hot right now, black is in. But you continue to do that not only in 14 but 15 as well. So tell me a little bit about what you think that's done for the Madison community, particularly for the white community that's more tuned into these issues because of what Cap Times has done.
Well, that is a difficult answer if I don't to try to be humble, because I do like to think we have made a difference and have changed the conversation. So I wear a bunch of different hats, and I mentioned this to you before, but you came into my office once and we were having this candid conversation, and you said, am I talking to a publisher, a columnist, an editor, a funder, or a friend?
Right.
And I said yes, because I'm all of those things. I think the from the editor standpoint, there's the editor role, which is apportioning resources, staff resources, to looking for stories from the communities of color. I was struck once, whether it was you or someone else, who told me that white media only shows up when there's police tape and isn't there, and we don't have, we struggle to diversify our newsroom, and because story ideas come from people's experiences and what they hear and see, and so that's important as well. I do think the Cap Times has done a good job of looking for stories beyond white Madison, and sometimes they show up in things like our Q&As. We will do a Q&A with someone who's doing interesting things up and coming, and if you look back at 52 weeks of our Q&As, you'd find so our commitment shows up there as well as in major things like Justified Anger. And I think that the editor piece of this is that the Capital Times aspires to be a high-quality journalistic resource for people who love Madison, who brand themselves with Madison, who find our coverage to be authentic and take them to places they wouldn't otherwise go, and to experience the city fully. And I think that so the communities of color emphasis within that is part of a bigger whole. And so there's that role. I also do a weekly column, which today by the time this appears, it'll also be in print about Michael Johnson's return. I talked to him a few days ago about, and he came back to our Cap Times Idea Fest in the fall, and he is a really interesting leader, character coming back to lead the Boys and Girls Club. And so I write columns, and my columns are both opinion, but they're also reported. So I have my own following of people, and I go from topic to topic to try to bring people, have a take, but to bring people into a deeper understanding of Madison. So there's that role. So those are two media roles. I'll get to the larger media question in a second. The Cap Times, however, it's really kind of inseparable. That I mentioned William T. Eviu earlier, who died in 1970. Well, he created a foundation on his death and his will, and we've given away almost $60 million. And I'm on the Eviu board, and I can tell you that the Eviu board lives the values of the Capital Times on those kind of topics, and looks to support this community through its philanthropy. And the connection between philanthropy and journalism is sort of my job, and it isn't the reporter's and editor's job to do, but that's also there. I think that one observation, there's been a lot of times in the last few years when I've been outraged at something that's come up in the news in the era of Trump related to race. And African Americans I know kind of have that look at me like, you didn't know this is the way it is.
Right.
This
Like,
is
you're
the
not
way
really
it's always
surprised
been.
by this.
You're not really surprised by this. And so there's been quite a bit of that. I think I gave a whole sermon actually at First Unitarian as a guest speaker in July on Wither the Press. And the press is under tremendous pressure nationally. It's fragmenting. There are all sorts of different things going on. I think that it then, one observation I would have is that in the era of Trump and the last couple of years of this sort of populist movement, that a lot of coverage has moved more toward the most outrageous and maybe away from some of the more subtle coverage of race in Madison. I think there may be some sort of connection there, and this conversation, other things recently have gotten me to thinking about that. I do think that the major national papers, which I very much admire, the New York Times and Washington Post, do a pretty good job, as do some important periodicals, of going deeper on race. But it is, and racial topics, but it is hard because there are so many fewer journalists than there once were. So it's less a malevolent kind of thing and more just a product of having fewer people to do things.
Sure. I appreciate that response. After J.A. ran 5 years, I got in a lot of hot water by people who continued to ask me how long I'd be angry. Do you think the kind of coverage that the Cap Times has given has helped non-blacks to become angrier at issues of disparity?
I would think so. I would think that would be a result.
Are you angrier about race relations than you were when we met?
I am. I often tell my wife something will happen, and were I Latino or African American, I'd be heading to the streets probably, and I probably should head to the streets as a white person. But
we need you in the streets, Paul.
I'm often struck by we live in more outrageous times than when you and I met, and I'm
knowingly outrageous times.
Yeah, and maybe I have that wrong. Maybe the outrageous this whole Make America Great Again.
My ears burn when you say that.
Yeah, was okay if you were white and male, and not it wasn't ever great if you weren't.
Definitely.
But I think that it's still everything around this conversation continues to be dynamic.
Yes.
I mean every
that's a good way of looking at it.
And every small decision we make about what to cover, what to emphasize, how to approach it, contributes to a longer continuum of the kind of progress we're making.
When Justified Anger came out and Cap Times committed to a focus on this issue, the issues of race relations. Because keep in mind, this is before Tony Robinson's shooting. Mm-hmm. It was before Tamir Rice, before Eric Garner. We were sort of ahead of the curve in terms of saying, here's what's coming down the pipeline. And so I'm curious, as you talked among your associates around the country, were they doing similar things? Was Cap Time seen as a thought leader because of the attention it was giving race relations? Again, particularly because you started doing this before it played out really big on the national stage.
I think there was some of that. You may recall that a UW professor named Sue Robinson did a book about coverage of this topic.
That's right.
And I do think that there was some of that feeling on the other side. And I spent many years in 10 jobs working as an editor and reporter at the State Journal. If you're an editor and not a publisher and not a columnist and not a philanthropist, there's a tendency to want to keep your subjects at arm's length. And there's not a racial component to that. It's just that you're outside observing and reporting on and not kind of a participant. So I would think that some newspaper editors would look at my story relative to this and say, that's not your role to get that close and that involved. And that's one of the things that would probably also come up. I think another thing that I've experienced over the last few years is I've gotten just close enough to sort of a critical mass of African Americans, thought leaders and otherwise, to realize that we tend, and in the white community, tend to look at your community as 3 or 4 prominent names and not understand all the roles that you play within the community and all of the relationships, tensions, rivalries. What's
There's no black monolith.
Yeah, and I think I'm not claiming to understand it. I'm just claiming that I understand that I don't understand it.
Sure. When I look at some of our local historic heroes, Mr. Evu, Bob LaFollette, or even President Van Heis's Wisconsin idea, former president of UW Madison. Do you think Madison's gotten typecast by having become known for either these individuals and these kinds of movements and don't necessarily feel the need to act today because we're writing on historic laurels?
I think that's a fair criticism. I think if you're white and you live your life in an upper middle class neighborhood like mine and drive a car to downtown Rotary and live in the circles I live in, that you're not confronted very much with naturally confronted in day-to-day life, and it's easy to feel pretty smug about living in a city that I think people believe has a big heart, but that big heart then doesn't necessarily extend to the kind of unified action that we need around race. It's always been mystifying to me that a community that has the soul of Madison falls so short so often on this topic.
As an editor, you gave space to my voice and the voice of many other African American influencers to tell their stories in a way that I think drew not only Madison, but the folks who read the shared stories from your website to think differently about race. The role of publishers is a little different. Do you have any thoughts about how this new role for you might allow unique opportunities or newer opportunities to empower and make people aware of these issues?
That's a really interesting question. I am more involved in the business side of the newspaper organization, and we have I have a new partner and a new publisher of the State Journal who's moving in from out of the market. He was a young child here in Madison, but hasn't been here for decades. I think the challenge for me personally is to find ways to better understand authentically what's going on, and then to take that deeper understanding and then apply it across story ideas for as an editor, column ideas as a columnist, philanthropic priorities within what the Evu Foundation does, and being that kind of voice to help people understand at a deeper level in ways that are actionable. That's the challenge, and frankly, a challenge beyond that for me then is to how do I accomplish that? What sorts of experience should I have? Where should I go? Who should I listen to? It's tremendously it's a tremendous challenge. One of the things in journalism is it's easier just to go to one person and have a conversation and
Right.
get kind of a tunnel vision of things. But journalism at its best is about talking to many people,
Right.
and then coming away from that and being able to synthesize
Sure.
what's the contextual kind of thing of what's really going on. And I hope to continue to do that with all these hats.
Definitely, definitely. Cap Times has been so clear in its commitment to telling stories and proliferating our voices. What motivates you to continue to think about how Cap Times continues to hire people who, from their own personal experiences, African Americans, can tell our stories as well? How does Cap Times keep itself motivated to continue to do that?
It's easy to keep motivated to do that. It's easy to keep motivated to looking for applicants and make connections in the community. The hard thing, and I don't mean to be negative about this, is that the business has changed a lot, and there's
Sure.
been. I think in a speech I gave, there are at least 1/3 fewer journalists in the country than there were 15 years ago or so.
Wow.
And so, I grew up in an industry that was very successful, and we had a lot of people and we had a lot of resources. So the challenge is not ideological, philosophical,
Sure.
or in any way not sort of full-on commitment to it. It's making sure you have the resources by building models
sure.
that succeed.
Sure. If I could just make a couple of suggestions as we wind down, because I know you're very busy, but one might be circling back as a publisher, maybe having a gathering, a listening session, just to have some of the folks who you've worked with over the past couple of years, particularly for my community, just to say, what are your dreams for a publisher? What do you need to know about what a publisher is or isn't? I think that dialogue around your role and not just around news telling could be very important, because I think people are interested in knowing that their voices are important to the business of news telling as much as having our stories told. So that might be something you could do just to have a conversation with folks, because I think what the task is at hand is we're wanting to tell more positive stories, so Black stories that are more positive, and those are things that we've worked on. The other thing is that you're wanting to have more Black storytellers. We just had this conversation about writers, but then I think there's also space for Black voices, and so maybe one of the things that we can discuss, not on the air, but just over coffee or something,
Sure.
As newspapers become more digital, does a Cap Times look at partnering with a podcast like Black Like Me, or how do you find voices that are out there that are talking about a plethora of things, not just race, but ethnically diverse folks talking about leadership, a number of things? There might be opportunities to do that as well. Sometimes I think we become so narrowly focused on what diversity looks like, and sometimes if for whatever reason you can't find or won't find or don't find applicants who are Black, there's so many other things that I think can happen to make the Black experience or Black voices come alive. And so I think sometimes the white community is hard on itself when it can't hire certain talent, but you've got just a great platform for talented African-American thought leaders to influence other folks. And we might have to just think more creatively about that, if there's not enough Black writers, there may be Black podcasters. I know that this is something that's growing among African Americans, and there are folks who really want their voices told. So I hope that there are more listening sessions in the community, because I think the community wants to help you, help us, and help you. And I just think a conversation about where this is all going could be really powerful.
I agree with all that. I embrace it all. I'd like to make one point that's a little bit commercial, but in the last couple of years, we've started something called Cap Times Idea Fest, and
I participated in it last year.
You did, and we had it again this fall on campus, and it's going to be in mid-September of next year.
Great.
And we've had wonderful guests, 25 sessions. I've gotten a lot of criticism directed at me for what it wasn't. as opposed to what it was. And it was many fine things. We had a lot of great speakers and we got a lot of great feedback. But I guess I'm taking it as a compliment that people think it's important and valuable to the community, that they think we're falling short. And so the presence of the African American voice and experience is one of about 5 specific criticisms I've gotten. And I'd love to sit down and talk to a round table. The lack of that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. I mean, there's
in Madison, you got to ask.
The criticisms have been around around gender, around ideology, around race, around age.
Sure.
So we're working on all those things.
Gotcha.
And I think I could use that kind of session also to inform how we think about our big events.
I think that's really important.
Which is important to us in the future.
Paul, I really appreciate you're stopping by the Black Like Me studios. My guest today has been Paul Fanlund. He's the editor and the publisher of Cap Times. He is also on the board of the William T. Evu Foundation. In terms of, you just talked about a commercial. In terms of a commercial or a plug, I want to thank the Evu Foundation for giving us resources early on when Justified Anger was planning. But when we had our rollout 3 years ago, the Evu Foundation made a major contribution of $150,000, the first contribution we got to really move us along the way. And so I really appreciate that as well, in addition to the commitment to the coverage. I mean, there are always opportunities for conversations about what we want to see more of. But what I think we have too little of in this community is a chance to pause and say, I appreciate the commitment. We've been a recipient of it. By the time this podcast drops, front cover story is coming out with the Cap Times, where we're looking back 5 years on the launch of Justified Anger. And then we're looking forward 5 years because Justified Anger just received a $1 million grant from the Wisconsin Partnership Program through the UW-Madison School of Medicine and Public Health. And so those steps, that support, those stories put us on people's radar, Paul. And so you probably can't go around saying that, or if you do, it's probably a very small circle. But my grandmother taught me to not forget the bridge that brought you over. And so I really appreciate that. And so folks, listening all over the country, and I don't want to botch this by showing my shoddy memory right now, but for folks who are not in the Madison area who want to find the upcoming story about Justified Anger's 5th year history, what I know they can go to the Cap Times on Facebook.
CapTimes.com. Is a website.
Gotcha.
It's our website. We'll put it on Facebook and on my Facebook page, and it'll be available when this appears, I think. Definitely.
When this came out, I got a call from one of your reporters at week's end who said this was the most read story of the week. And I thought, this is great. And he was going to come to church. We had a crazy snowstorm. He called me back and said, this was the most read story of the month. And I thought, that's really cool. Then he called me back again and said Justified Anger was the 11th most read story of the year in 2013. And it came out December 18th. And there was a lot going on that year. Yeah. Aaron Rodgers' shoulder injury. I mean, there was a lot of news and things about Bush, but that was very, very cool. But there were thousands of shares on the Facebook page. So again, I really appreciate that partnership. I love the fact that you're allowing me to do a follow-up piece 5 years later that looks back and projects where we're going in the next 5 years, because that will grab readers who may be new to Madison, but hopefully it will rekindle just the conversations that we've had over the past 5 years about how we work together, how we continue to make Madison aware, to let it live out the truths of, what Mr. Evu wanted to do, or the Wisconsin idea, because I still believe that those things can happen if people know and if they're challenged. We're doing our U.S. Black History courses. So I'm being overwhelmed by white people in Madison who are responding, reading. I just did a story for a local news outlet yesterday because we're training court advocates, because judges have told us that when people sit in courts with defendants, the outcome's more favorable. So we have 30 folks who have been trained to go into courts and sit with people, and the judges love it. And we're capturing data. So we're touching the community in a very meaningful way. And but it started off with a discussion that we had at a coffee shop. And who knew that 5 years later we'd still be sitting here, Justified Anger would still be a thing, and that we still have a ways to go. But there's a mutual commitment to telling our story, not bumping heads, but still getting back up and working to make this community all that it can be. So I appreciate the role that you, Cap Times, and the Evu Foundation, that they play in that role, and for really partnering with Justified Anger and Nehemiah to really continue as a thought leader in bringing people together for collaborative effort and social collaboration. I think that's the only way we're going to fix racial injustice, is by bringing people together and not keeping them further apart. So thank you for your friendship and your support, but particularly for being a guest on Black Like Me today.
Thank you, Alex. Those are very kind words. It's been a joy to know you these years, and we're on the road, together, and the road continues.
Yes.
So more to come.
That's right.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you all again for being a part of the Black Like Me podcast. Continue to let your friends know what we're doing and what we're talking about, because we're really trying to make us united. We're just stronger together. And so I just know that today's episode is going to give you some insight. And so listen to it, continue to download, and let your friends know about it. If you want to contact me or suggest topics, you've got some black icebreakers, or what in the world's wrong with white people, or what are white people thinking, hit us up on Twitter, Facebook, on all the social media outlets, and we'd love to entertain your input. Have a great day.
Thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can find out more about Dr. Alex G's amazing work at www.alexg.com. Black Like Me is sponsored by the generosity of the Human Family Unity Foundation.